Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the 929 English Podcast. We have a special treat today as we welcome Michael Eisenberg. Michael Eisenberg is a general partner of Aleph, a venture capital fund. He's also the author of 3 books, including The Vanishing Jew and a new book called The Tree of Life and Prosperity, which is an analysis of the economic messages found in each of the weekly portions of the Torah. Hi, Michael, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Rabbi. Mintz, for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what drove you to put together your new book, The Tree of Life and Prosperity?
So first of all, to be perfectly honest, I did not start out to write a book. I began by telling over Torah anecdotes and insights in the weekly Torah portion to my kids at the Shabbat table. Then I kind of wrote those down after Shabbat was over. And over the years, it turned out that I had accumulated something on just about every one of the weekly Torah portions. And then about 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I began to send out a weekly WhatsApp of these, pretty long. They were kind of 6 to 8 pages each, analyses of the weekly Torah portion. And then thereafter, somebody came to me and said, hey, you really ought to turn this into a book. And so was born the book. And my general approach or feeling about people who opine on the Torah and on the biblical scripture is everybody brings their own personal experiences, circumstances, what they do for a living, etc., to looking at the verses in the Torah. And just like Ibn Ezra brought the fact that he was poor to looking at it, and Abarbanel, who was the Secretary of the Treasury in Portugal and Spain, he brought his economic view to it, or his view of what a king should be like, and Maimonides as a doctor, someone close to the king brought his. So since I'm a businessman, a venture capitalist, deal with the economy all day, I guess I brought mine as well when looking at these topics.
That's absolutely fascinating. And you were mentioning to me before that this is the first book of this type that's been written since a book that was written in German 125 years ago. So it really is a contribution to the study of the weekly portion, to Torah, and hopefully maybe also to the study of economics. And I was wondering, Michael...
it turns out... Oh, sorry.
You go.
I was just going to say, it turns out that not many people who are in business or economics publish on the Torah. I actually was unaware of any books looking at the Torah through economic or business eyes. A friend of mine, Abraham Frankel, sent me a book by his great-great-great-great-grandfather, written 125 years ago in Germany, in German. He said he doesn't know what's written in there because he doesn't read German anymore, but someone told him that was the topic.
So that's great. So can you give us one or two examples of the work and how you use the weekly portion to share an economic message?
So I want to be clear. This is not kind of homiletics where I use the weekly portion to share economic messages. These are actually economic issues that the Torah is dealing with, and all I'm doing is trying to explain the verses and the words that appear there. So let's take an example from last week's Torah portion, which is Lech Lecha. And in Lech Lecha, quite shockingly, one of the words that repeats itself over and over and over again is rechush, possessions. And the Torah takes extreme measures to tell us how wealthy Avram was. Not just the wealth and possessions, the rechush he brought with him from Haran in English, but the extreme wealth he left Egypt with, the fact that wealth came between him and his nephew Lot and caused a split in the family. Parenthetically, we all know about wealth that splits families, unfortunately. And this is a major topic in the Bible, so much so that one of the things I contend is that while the Mishnah says that Avram had 10 tests, which I think are correct, and every commentator has a different list of 10. I actually think that in this week's portion, it's one long test, which is how does one, in this case, Abraham, and later the Jewish people, manage wealth as a population. And we're not the first people, we're the first people to think of this, but this is a popular topic. So, for example, Andrew Carnegie wrote a treatise entitled On Wealth, in which he describes how the wealthy will manage the assets on behalf of the poor so that everybody may live in harmony. That is quite a paternalistic view of wealth. And my personal perspective on it, and what I think the Torah is trying to tell us, is the following. First of all, Avram's father, Terach, settles in Haran. And in Haran, he seems to become wealthy because Avram leaves Haran with all of the possessions that they accumulated here, as the Bible describes it. And then he comes to the land of Israel, and the Torah tells us something really fascinating, that he took with him his nephew. We actually know only one biographical fact about this nephew. We know his genealogy, but the biographical fact we know is that Lot is an orphan. His father passed away in Haran, Haran in English. And Avram brings his nephew with him to the land of Israel with the possessions. And I think the first indication the Torah is trying to give us is one who takes his wealth with him, or who carries wealth, or is wealthy, must take care of the orphan, or more broadly, the widow, the orphan, and the less fortunate in society. But I think we also see that this is not a paternalistic relationship as Carnegie would have it, but Avram then goes down to Egypt because of the famine in the land of Israel. And in the case of going down to Egypt, he becomes more wealthy despite the famine. He develops wealth based on his relationship, association with the king there, and the fact that his wife/sister was taken by the king. And this is a different kind of wealth accumulated through political connections. And then he leaves Egypt, and the Bible again tells us that Avram is extraordinarily wealthy. He has oxen and camels and gold and silver and everything else. And it tells us that Lot too became wealthy there, meaning Avram used his influence to take care and put his nephew into business, and enable him to become himself a well-to-do man. And I can go on for hours, but the question then becomes, what is the message of the Bible with this? And this leads to the break in the family. So we can point out that when Avram leaves Haran, the Bible talks in a plural term, Vayetzu lalechet arka to Canaan, and they left together to go to Canaan, and all of the verbs are in the plural form. When Avram and Lot leave Egypt with their wealth, the Torah moves to a singular form, Vayisal Masav, and he goes on his quests, and he goes around and builds the altars and calls out in God's name. And Avram understands that the purpose of wealth is to call out in God's names and reflect his values. Lot, on the other hand, who became wealthy from these connections to the government, decides that wealth exists for wealth's sake, and therefore seeks out to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, a place endowed with natural resources where you could become close to the kings and the princes of the provinces there. So I go on for a long time, but relevant to last week's Torah portion, that's one. If you want me to give another example, I know that was long-winded. I could as well.
Well, I mean, let's just let's unpack that amazing example. That actually takes us last week's Torah portion and this coming week's Torah portion, so it's full of material for everybody. But really, what you're looking at is different attitudes towards wealth, and the fact that Avraham and Lot have different attitudes towards wealth. What about Hagar and Yishmael? What about that whole issue of property being people, and how that also caused a rift in the family? Is that relevant to what you're interested in?
So I did not deal with that specific instance in this volume of the book. I think in general, the Torah, and for that time it was not unusual, understand that there were people who were possessions. Right? Slavery is not outlawed in the Torah. When we get to the book of Exodus, I treat this in the parsha of Bishalach and Mishpatim at that point. I know that because I've sent the second volume to the publisher as of yesterday.
Good. Okay. So that's what I was kind of looking for, to see how everything connects with one another. So the answer is yeah, of course, meaning that there's one idea of property in the sense of Avraham and Lot, the way they understand property and wealth. but there's also the idea of owning people, the question of slavery and what it means to have possession of people. And that obviously is related also in this week's parsha. So can you give us...
I actually think, to just jump in on that 1 second, I actually think in a more modern sense, there is what I call in the next volume of the book, de jure slavery and de facto slavery. And the Torah actually is more interested in combating de facto slavery than it is de jure slavery, because de jure slavery existed. What the Torah was more concerned about is that people would become slaves to routine. People would become slaves to working nonstop 7 days a week, because as we know, the week is an artificial construct. Right? The month is lunar, the year is solar, the day is night and dark, but the week is an artificial construct constructed by the Bible, actually, by the Torah and the Jewish people, and by God passing down the Masorah at Mount Sinai. That's our construct, and we're the first people to stop that de facto slavery of 7 days a week working. But that's for another time, perhaps, and maybe another parsha.
Good. I mean, and the fact that you're not allowed to be a slave forever, that there's a limit, that 6 years you work and then you go free. Also, the fact that that you shouldn't get too comfortable being a slave.
Absolutely.
Just to kind of go back to what you said as you introduced your insight into these parshiot of Lech Lecha and Vayera, and that is that you're not looking for a homiletic message. This is not a rabbi sermon on Shabbat morning. This is really a study of the Chumash, a study of the Bible, and trying to understand the way the Bible grapples with real-time economic issues, some of which were relevant only in the ancient world, are not relevant today, such as slavery, and some of which, like you described with Avraham and Lot, are as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. And
I'm gonna argue that all of the topics are actually relevant. Even the notion of slavery, let's wait for the next volume on that. But Rabbi Benny Lau, when he spoke at a book launch event in Tel Aviv, I said to him, what's the core lesson you take away from the book? He said, nothing's changed. People are the same. Economics, the modes are different, but they're the same. The thing to understand about an economic view of Torah is we're all homo economicus, we're economic animals. We spend most of our day earning a living. That's what we do. And as the famous song says, but it's a verse in Ecclesiastes as well, is that money does make the world go round. Not in the negative sense of people with money can, buy influence, but in the real sense of the word, which is, we spend our days earning incomes, trying to buy things. Bad economies, we know, lead to anti-Semitism is one example, but it leads to people being, depressed. It causes marital and family strife. These are the real issues that we all deal with every day. And they were true in the time of the Bible. Every portion has got one. Literally every one. And, next week is a story of the First World War in the Middle East, or in Mesopotamia, between Kedar Laomer and the kings of the 5 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, etc. What are they fighting over? It's because he saw the natural resources of Sodom and Gomorrah and enslaved the people there for 12 years so he could get tribute, so he could get his taxes. That's what the war's about. And if you don't believe me, the whole war is about that, because the Bible tells us that Abraham goes out to get it, and he returns all of the wealth and possessions. And all disagreement at the end with the king of Sodom, is, he says to him, the king of Sodom says to him, just give me the people, you take the wealth. He thinks that Abraham came to fight for the wealth. These are the topics in every week. And Joseph is the first secretary of the Treasury of Egypt, finance minister, depending on where you live. And Abraham and Jacob and Esau fight over what? Over the blessing. What's the blessing? May God give you from the fruits of the land, the fat of the land. It's an economic blessing. It's everywhere.
So that's fascinating, and Rabbi Benny Lau's point, of course, that things don't change. That's the ultimate message of the book. I want to go back to something that you mentioned in passing just a second ago. That's the idea that economics is the root of so much anti-Semitism. And it's fascinating that also appears in these parshiot that we've read, because when this past week, when Avraham and Sarah go to Egypt, so we kind of focus on the fact that Avraham says that Sarah is his sister. But Paro, as interested as he is in Sarah, he's also interested in Avraham's wealth. So that's not exactly anti-Semitism, but it's identification of Avraham with his wealth, and therefore the way that he's dealt with is based on how much money he has.
I'm going to make a slightly different argument than that, which is that Paro's interest in Avraham's wealth, and for example, the Hittites' interest in Avram having a burial place among them, it turns into the Marat HaMachpelah, where our forefathers are buried in Hebron, is because they want to assimilate his wealth into them. Paro's interest and the Hittites' interest is they see a wealthy guy, let's assimilate him into our midst. By the way, the same thing happens with Shem later on. When Jacob comes back to the land of Israel, they want to assimilate the wealthy guy into their society. And in my book, The Vanishing Jew, what I chart is a little bit the opposite, which is, you have the anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish wealth, but the reality is the following. The better the economy is, and the better Jews have done in society, the more assimilated they become. When economies go down, it brings out the demons of anti-Semitism and brings out the people who charge the Jews with the anti-Semitic tropes. But anti-Semitism thrives in down economies and in pockets of society where the economy is down. There are two professors, King and Blaustein, who did an unbelievable piece of research on the different regions in Germany and parts of Poland where anti-Semitism rose. And they looked at it on a county-by-county basis, basically. And you can point to a few things which cause it. One is a down economy. The other is a delta in the number of Jews living in a certain area. The more the population rose to a certain tipping point, the anti-Semitism reared its ugly head. And the third thing, which is not going to be popular when I say it, is when Jewish intelligentsia joined the left, the far left of it. We see this, by the way, in England right now and a few other places. That ultimately tips the anti-Semitic scale. But it's really good economies that lead to assimilation, not the opposite.
And of course, not talking about modern politics, but going back to the time of Avraham, I think exactly what you said, and that is that Paro and the Hittites, they're not critical of Avraham for having his wealth. They're actually either jealous or they want to assimilate his wealth. Means they respect Avraham more the more wealthy that he is. And the same thing is true with Yitzchak, as the stories go on. Now, you're right that's ironic because it's the wealth that causes a split in the family with Lot. It's the same wealth that Paro wants to assimilate and that he's jealous about that causes the rift between Avraham and Lot. So it's kind of a tension almost in what the role of Avraham's wealth is in last week's parsha.
So one of the things I point out in the book, I call it the political addendum to last week's piece, is that if one looks carefully at the words around this family rift, it is about wealth and money, unquestionably. But you got to ask yourself, Avram has one relative other than his wife. It's his nephew. Is there really going to be a family split over wealth? That feels outrageous. So I think if you look at the words carefully, the Torah used the words nasa, which means to hold up an ideal. Right? If we look through the Torah, we know that a nasi, a president, is the same root of the word. Lahasi etzah, as we say, is to give a large piece of advice. And what's really going on there, if you read the verses carefully, is each of Avram and Lot have an economic philosophy and policy. Lot's is to use wealth to create more wealth and damn be the morals and the ethics. And Avram's is to use wealth to spread the ethical word of God. And what happens is each one is looking for a polis with which to spread their message. And that's what can't exist together. We can't have competing political parties trying to spread absolutely different messages of wealth. One is a just gatherer of wealth for wealth's sake, damn be the morals, and he goes to Sodom. And the other wants to spread the good cheer not in a paternalistic way, but in an enabling way to go do that. And that's why Avram needs to split with them. There was just too much noise in the political environment to go do that.
That's fascinating. And you're saying, and in next week's parasha, the Torah itself takes a stand on this issue by destroying Sodom. Because Lot's vision of wealth is just wrong. It's not that they're two competing visions and they're both right, but one is right and one is wrong, and Sodom has to be destroyed.
Yes, I would say even more than that. Sodom inevitably implodes on itself because it can't. God is just providing the finishing touches to it. A society can't survive hakitza'akata, one where people are crying out because they are afflicted by the selfishness of that society, by the crassness of that society, and by the corrupt morals of that society. It implodes. God just finishes the deal.
And Lot's mistake or his misunderstanding is the fact that he chooses Sodom.
It's really that he becomes wealthy and forgets the mission. And therefore he chooses Sodom.
Yeah.
Sodom is an obvious choice for him once you kind of become selfishly wealthy and view wealth as being a way to lord power.
This is Michael. This is an amazing conversation. We could go on for hours. I know that tonight you have your book launch. We all want to wish you good luck in the book launch. You want to encourage all of our listeners to get a copy of The Tree of Life and Prosperity. It's in Hebrew now. It's going to be in English, and we're looking forward to this and to all of your contributions of the weekly portions of the entire Torah. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time this afternoon to speak with us. And I want to thank everybody, all of our listeners of the 929 English podcast, for being part of the 929 English family. Come visit our webpage. Michael has contributed to our webpage, and you can enjoy both his written pieces and his video, a conversation with Aaron Kohler. And join us at 929.org.io. Thank you so much.